Chapter 12. The Sinking of the Hyūga. I spent 10 weeks in basic combat training, and the whole time that trio of weirdos hung around me until I didn't think of them as weirdos anymore. That didn't stop the rest of the soldiers from doing that, however. James never did live down that first day of training, and everyone took to calling him Icky. Kate was quite literally child-sized, so no one took her seriously until the first day of combative training, when she put Drill Sergeant Ray in a headlock on her first try. Then people focused on Mateo and I a bit more. Our Hispanic friend caught a lot of flack from the rest of the platoon for not being born in America. As far as I can remember, Mateo Hernandez was born from somewhere south of Mexico City. We got a crash course in drill and ceremony, the warrior ethos, tactical movement, and rifle marksmanship. I was downright terrible at long range, only hitting targets that were close by. By the time training ended, I could count on one hand the number of times I hit a distant target with my rifle, and the number of times Kate hit the target for me when the drill sergeants weren't looking. Meanwhile, the war was still going. The drill sergeants constantly updated us on the situation in Japan and Eastern Europe. We all knew that we would end up in this fight sooner or later. All I cared about was going to Japan. If I could get onto those islands, I could try and find a Sami. When we graduated from basic training, my dad came down to Fort Jackson for the ceremony. Our unit marched across the field with our regimental colors flying proudly, and I got to shake hands with a general, and my dad gave a speech to us all. He talked about how proud he was that we volunteered for this war, and that America was praying for all of us. After that, we were off to advanced training, our final stop before the war. Kate, Mateo, Icky and I parted ways here, but not before we promised one another that we would try to link up again in Japan. "I want to see that princess for myself, Blake," Icky teased me. "If you need help, call me and I'll be there." "Screw that, y'all need to introduce me to her brother." Kate fanned herself. "Then we can go get that girl." "I know you want to do this alone, Blake," Mateo finished, "but you don't have to. A lot of people will give a damn if you just give them the chance." Mateo went to Fort Sill to become an artillery gunner. Kate headed off to sniper school. Icky joined military intelligence. And me? I spent the winter of 2011 at Fort Gordon, where I became a signalman. By the time 2012 began, I knew my way around most of the Army's communication technology. I could even assemble and raise a 60-foot radio antenna by myself. I remember at the time I felt hopeful that I could somehow put that knowledge to use finding a Sami. I wouldn't have long to find out. The war came for us all in time, and we rose to meet it. Someone else was rising to meet her own challenges halfway around the world. By good luck, or perhaps bad, I arrived in Japan right as the war was entering its final act. In early 2012, the Soviet Union was falling victim to its own gargantuan size. Soviet forces in Japan were starting to suffer from a very serious supply problem. Fighting battles against dozens of enemies all over the world was putting a potentially lethal strain on the Soviet economy and highlighting a crucial difference between the Soviet Union and the Allies arrayed against it. Russia had been in a near constant state of war since 1993. The Soviet people and economy were becoming exhausted. In Washington, Tokyo, and Moscow, leaders were being briefed on the need to end the war quickly. My dad was informed by General Laura Harper that the Soviets were likely to resort to the use of nuclear weapons again if they got the impression the war was unwinnable. Irisha Kimoto was being told the same thing by General Artyom Sidorov. Each side believed the other was running out of options and willing to do something rash. The so-called People's Republic was on its last legs. The Soviet Union was barely able to sustain its own war effort, let alone prop up a puppet state. The fake government in Hokkaido was resorting to conscription of prisoners because there were no volunteers left to use. Even then, people were deserting and abandoning the Japanese communists in massive droves. Japan itself was battered but still fighting. Western Europe was a live battlefield, while Ukraine reeled from having been nuked multiple times. About 6 million people were dead on all sides, and now America and Russia were looking for the chance to inflict a knockout blow. In the east, the Soviets were actively hunting the Japanese government. Helicopter raids, airstrikes, and Spetsnaz incursions occurred on a near-daily basis. U.S. military intelligence theorized that the Russians were plotting to kill off all members of the Japanese leadership, leaving the so-called People's Republic to pick up the pieces. Modern historians disagree with this idea. Our family friend Chris Wright suggests the Soviets were aiming to kidnap members of the government in order to force a favorable peace between Japan and the USSR. Meanwhile, in the West, another coup de grace was being prepared. German, British, French, Swedish, American, Polish, and Canadian soldiers were massing near Minsk in Belarus. It was obvious to everyone that the Allies were preparing to make a mad dash for Moscow. The entire war was coming down to a simple question. Japan and the Soviet Union each had a knife to their throats. Who was going to die first? As the final summer of World War III began, the slashing started. But before we get to the cutting of throats, I need to make clear where my future wife was during all of this. Around the winter of 2011, I genuinely believed that Asami had joined the Ground Defense Force and was fighting on the Japanese mainland. I was wrong. She had actually joined the Maritime Defense Force and was at sea the whole time. My wife has lost count of how many times she's told and retold the following story. When we put this book together, she told me she was overjoyed about her tale finally being preserved in writing. Chihiro hopes she won't have to repeat herself anymore. I graduated naval training in November 2011, and no one ever suspected I wasn't who I said I was. Everybody in the JSDF thought I was Chiho Tatsuya, an 18-year-old high school dropout. They were so desperate for people that no one ever tried to verify my age or identity. I was training to be a yeoman for the longest time, but at the last second, the Admiralty decided I would be better off as a machinist's mate. It had something to do with me being so much smaller than most people my age. I went back into training for another few months, and on New Year's Day, 2012, I became the newest wrench wench aboard the Hyūga. There really was great demand for small-sized people in the JMSDF. The Hyūga wasn't a very old ship, but she wasn't getting the proper maintenance because she was always on combat patrol. Little people like me had to crawl into the tight spaces to fix stuff that was normally only dealt with when the ship was in dry dock. I would go for days at a time without seeing the sun, because I'd be so deep inside the heart of the ship. The Hyūga was a helicopter destroyer, built with only one purpose in life, hunting submarines. And we were damn good at our jobs. Every time a Soviet boat tried to slip past us and into the Pacific, the Hyūga would show up. The ship might have looked like a mini aircraft carrier, but all we had were helos. They'd fly out over the ocean and drop little sonar devices so we could scan for subs. And when we found one, the helos would come back, get loaded up with torpedoes and mines and bombs. Then they'd fly back and blow those cowardly communists out of the water. Then, one day, one of them did it to us. June 2nd, 2012, off the coast of Cape Hedo, near Okinawa Island. I remember being woken up in my bunk at some ungodly hour. My bunkmate was shaking my feet to get my attention. "The alarm's going off, Tatsuya-san!" Petty Officer Kaneda yelled. "Get to your action station!" We'd done this so many times now that I could have found my way to my action station with my eyes closed. In fact, I basically did. I wasn't as enthusiastic as when I was a little girl. I went into the MSDF thinking I would get to shoot up Soviet warships with a deck gun or something silly like that. The Navy didn't need more gunners. They needed mechanics. spending my military life below decks, not seeing any of the action I wanted when I was younger, sucked some of the energy right out of me. There were 4 of us at my station, a petty officer and a few apprentice seamen. We were supposed to do maintenance and troubleshooting on one of the 4 engines. It was a boring job. Most of the mechanical equipment aboard the Hyūga was computerized. All the bridge crew had to do was push some buttons, and the ship would go where they wanted. The people below decks were just here to make sure the machinery played nice with the people up top. One of the people on my team was a woman named Inamura. Like me, she was tiny enough to carry spare parts and tools into the dark and narrow corners of the Hyūga. At the end of a normal workday, we'd be so covered in oil and grease that nobody could tell us apart. Inamura and I were used to combat maneuvers. From the moment we were called up to action stations, the bridge started banking hard in one direction or another, and then accelerated hard. "We've got to be chasing a sub," Inamura cried as we were almost thrown against a bulkhead wall by a very sharp turn. "Either that or we're being chased," I answered, putting my hand on the engine cowling to feel for unusual vibrations. Then the ship took another violent turn, this time listing about 15 degrees to starboard. One of Inamura's toolboxes slid away and hit a far wall with a loud noise, and we both threw our hands up and cheered like we were on an amusement park ride. There wasn't anything amusing about our situation. What happened was that one of the Hyūga's helicopters was on a routine anti-submarine patrol, dropping sonobuoys into the water like normal, when their sonar suite picked up a submarine contact. There was a Soviet nuclear attack sub lurking off the coast of Okinawa, about 300 meters below the surface. The Hyūga gave chase, using her complement of helicopters to drop torpedoes and mines on the enemy. I guess our pilots weren't having a good day. I think the enemy sub was able to raise its floating wire antenna and call for help. Or maybe the Soviets just had someone else in the area and they gave away our position. Either way, a pair of Su-27 fighters came from the north and started taking shots at our helos. All of our pilots had to break contact with the sub and scatter. Down there in the hold, Inamura and I had no idea the ship was suddenly vulnerable. We just gripped the handrails and kept our eyes squarely on that big engine turbine, waiting for something to go wrong so we could fix it. Up on the flight deck, the SAM launcher, surface-to-air missiles, was struggling to keep up with the 2 Soviet fighters. We could only fight one of them at a time, and the danger was getting pretty real. Inamura and I realized the situation was bad when the captain's voice came over the speakers and said, "Don your fire suits!" We had to put on these really heavy garments made of fire-resistant materials. I was starting to feel really nervous, so Inamura tried to calm me down by telling a joke. "Wouldn't it be totally stupid if we did all this to stop ourselves getting burned, then we just sink and drown anyway?" That was when the torpedo hit us. The entire ship lifted out of the ocean for a few seconds, then came crashing back down. The Hyūga broke her back instantly, and water started coming in through the bottom of the keel. For Inamura and I, there was a bang so loud I could feel an awful pain in my ears. We were thrown up in the air, dashed our heads on the ceiling, and then hit the floor just as violently. I couldn't move for almost a minute, my head hurt so badly. Inamura rolled me over and pulled off the hood of my fire suit. I could see blood running down the side of her head. "Oh God, we're rolling to starboard!" Inamura yelled. "Get up, Tetsuya! Get up!" I got this terrible sense of vertigo as I stood up. The whole carrier was twisting under my feet, listing sharply to one side, and a terrible creaking sound was coming from somewhere fore of our position. I swayed on my feet and fell onto the engine, which was now silent and motionless. One of the turbines was smashed to bits, and Inamura and I were both covered head to foot in oil, water, and in her case, blood. We stared at one another in shock for about 2 seconds. Then we noticed the heat. "Fire!" I shouted. "Fire in the next room!" There was a double deluge coming from the bulkhead door leading towards the midsection of the ship. Black smoke was flowing from the upper half of the door, and water was pouring in through the bottom half. Inamura threw a switch, and the bulkhead door slammed shut. But before the door fell into position, we did get a good look inside. A roiling, frothing, chaotic rush of seawater was flooding into the engine room. As the door slammed down, Inamura and I could hear the captain's voice, full of static and sounding tinny over the intercom. "Evacuate! Evacuate! Evacuate!" The Hyūga was sinking. Like I said, the ship broke her back and was starting to split in half. When Inamura and I ran for the stairs, one of the great big engines broke free of its mounting and fell straight through the bulkhead. In seconds, all 4 of Hyūga's engines fell out of the ship and started the long trip down to the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Tired and sweaty, Inamura and I reached the flight deck, where all of the helos take off and land. The Hyūga was foundering, her flight deck mere meters above the waterline. Inflatable life rafts were all over the place, and a few were on the flight deck itself. Inamura and I started running towards the nearest life raft, where several sailors were trying to set up an orange canopy to shelter beneath. Before we'd gone a few paces, a petty officer waved at us and shouted, "Get down!" I hit the deck, grabbing Inamura by the arm and pulling her down with me. The soldier raised a submachine gun and started firing at something over our heads. In between bursts of gunfire, I finally heard a noise I'd missed before. There was some kind of military transport helicopter hovering just 10 meters above the water, the red star of the Soviet Union painted on its side. A side door was open, and a female soldier was in the belly of the helo. I can still remember her to this very day. I was taken aback because the pale-skinned, black-haired woman in that helo was clearly Asian. She was holding a pair of binoculars in one hand and was staring directly at Inamura and me. My husband, daughter, grandchild, and all of our family friends tell me that the Soviet woman in that chopper was almost certainly my other daughter, Akira. I know full well that the paradox is from a distant, previous timeline, but I personally believe that does not make her any less my own flesh and blood. I can recognize my daughter Himawari and my son Marcus under any circumstance. That woman in that helo was not Akira. I will bet my life on that. Regardless of who was watching me from the helo, the gunfire from Hyūga's flight deck caused the pilot to pull back on the column. The helicopter veered away from us just as the water started to wash up on the deck. Inamura screamed, "That's the last life raft! Come on!" She tried to drag me towards an inflatable life raft that was sitting on the flight deck, but we were both covered in oil and couldn't grip one another. About 30 sailors were clambering aboard the canvas vessel, and the 2 of us threw ourselves inside. A moment later, the Hyūga finally succumbed to her injuries. The ship's keel, already broken, snapped like a twig. Broken cleanly in half, the 2 halves of the Hyūga began to sink very quickly. Bow and stern rose into the water, while the island tower collapsed into pieces. My lifeboat was on the bow. The bow rose to a sharp angle, pointing about 25 degrees into the sky, while the stern aimed in the opposite direction at a similar angle. For us in the lifeboat, the flight deck turned into a slide. And if I have my way, I will never ride any kind of slide again. I was barely in the lifeboat. I think I was climbing over somebody's legs, heading for a free seat when the lifeboat started accelerating. In seconds, we were going faster than a speeding car, screaming down the flight deck towards the ocean. The mess of people inside the flimsy inflatable boat were bounced and thrown around as we hit some kind of bump on the way down. It was chaos. The inflatable lifeboat, with about 30 people inside, hit the water at high speed, maybe about 30 miles per hour. I'm pretty sure most of the people inside the boat were killed on impact. I remember being dazed and stunned for a moment. There was wreckage and bodies all around me, and I was swimming in oil. The sounds of people screaming and the 2 halves of the ship sinking overpowered everything else, and I could see the enemy helo again. It was being chased by a fighter jet. The red and white roundel of my own country painted on the side. It was friendly. From somewhere to my left, I heard Inamura shout, "Hell yeah! Shoot that bastard down!" With a deep, gurgling rumble, whatever remained of the Hyūga slid beneath the water, leaving myself and the survivors treading water in the middle of an oil slick in the Pacific Ocean. I kicked off my fire suit, leaving me in just my combat uniform. I didn't have a life preserver, so I made a very crude flotation device by pulling off my pants, tying the legs together, and filling them with air. By my best guess, about 200 people survived the sinking of the Hyūga. Most of us were in lifeboats, but including myself and Inamura, there were an extra 24 people in the water. I heard a sound like a waterfall, and then something huge and metal erupted into view. An enemy nuclear attack submarine surfaced about 200 meters away from the spot where the Hyūga went down. One of its torpedo tubes was still open. All of the lifeboats changed course and started heading towards the sub, while our comrades in the water started calling out to the enemy ship. "Help us! Send a rope, a life vest, anything, please! Get us out of here!" A hatch opened, and men came out of the sub's conning tower. Even at that distance, I could see the pistols in their hands. Behind me, Inamura called out, "Tatsuya, come on!" I looked around and saw my shipmate was swimming the other way, the opposite direction from the sub. "Where are you going?" I yelled. "The Russians are that way." "Exactly," Inamura replied. "Follow me. We can make Okinawa." I was so stunned. My head went under the oil for a second. Spluttering, I shouted back, "That's like 10 kilometers from here." "Well, I'm not getting on any Ruski sub," Inamura shrieked. "Did you see what they did to the women in Sapporo? Hakodate? How about Akita or Sendai? What about Fukushima? You must have heard about that one." I shut up for a few seconds. Everybody knew about the atrocities the Soviets were committing against the people they conquered, including the horrible, disturbing rumors of mass rape. I didn't say so out loud, but I knew Inamura was right. Any non-Russian woman who found herself alone with a Soviet soldier would almost certainly be assaulted, and that was all the two of us could think about. I hesitated. I was rationalizing a way out of swimming such a great distance when rescue was right behind us. "But Okinawa's so far," I protested. "If we don't get on the sub, we'll die out here. And maybe they won't hurt us." I felt stupid, even as the words left my mouth. "You really want to take that chance?" Inamura said forcefully. "Those Russian bastards will probably kill you once they've had their fun. You can risk it if you want, but I am not getting raped. I'm going." Inamura started to swim away, the Soviet sub behind her. I floated along for a minute. I just couldn't think of what to do. It was probably the sickest, most stomach-churning decision I would ever make in my life. I was frightened of drowning. Inamura was scared of being assaulted. No matter which way I looked at our situation, at least one of those things was definitely going to happen. And there was a decent chance that both would happen. I was choosing between two nightmares, and it made me sick. I vomited into the oil, then took one final look at the enemy sub. In the afternoon light, I could see dozens of Japanese sailors standing on the deck, their hands raised above their heads. Even more Soviets with pistols and submachine guns were coming out to greet them. I swore a few times, then decided I would rather drown trying to reach Okinawa than go through whatever hell the enemy had in store for me. It only took a few dozen strokes for me to get out of the oil slick and back into open water. Inamura was a good distance ahead, but I got within shouting distance of her before too long. "How do you even know Okinawa's over there?" I called to her. "Look at the horizon," Inamura called back. "See it?" I probably would have been able to see the island better on the Hyūga's flight deck. When my head was just barely above the waterline, the island was just barely visible. For me, it was little more than a dark smudge on the southern horizon. "That's Cape Hedo," Inamura told me. "I heard someone say yesterday that we were sailing around the northern side of Okinawa this morning. The Americans have an airbase on the island, so that's got to be where those friendly jets came from." "Oh God, that looks stupid far away." "Don't say stuff like that, Tatsuya," Inamura shouted. "You gotta start, and then keep going. Stroke, stroke, stroke. One hand in front of the other. Let's go." And we did. Together, the two of us started the long swim. Behind us, I could hear a deep rumbling sound. The sub was diving. Inamura told me not to look back, and I obeyed. I kept my eyes locked on that distant island and started swimming. We swam for hours. My arms and legs and torso all got tired and started to burn as though I was running a marathon, and I complained about how bad I was feeling all the time. Inamura only let us stop for short breaks. We'd float on our backs and catch our breath for a few minutes before pressing on once more, keeping our destination in sight. As the sun got lower and lower in the sky, I could see that I was actually catching up with Inamura. At the start, we were so far apart that we had to shout all the time. But when the sun got low and touched the sea, we were close enough to see one another's faces clearly. I still remember her. Inamura looked a little like me, bluish eyes and straight dark hair. She was bigger than me, though. I'm sure she was a few years older than me, which would have made sense, given how I'd lied about being 18 just to enlist. I wish I'd been a better companion for her. Any time I wasn't complaining, I was spouting all sorts of doom and gloom. "I'm really cold. I don't want to die. I'm so scared. I'm so tired. Where are you? Don't leave me out here." Every time I whined, she'd say things like, "Come on, you're not done yet. Keep pushing. You've got so much more in you. You can make it." Not a day goes by when I wish I could have been better company for Inamura. I wish I learned her full name. After what felt like an eternity, the sun went down completely, and we were in darkness. We could only keep track of each other by listening for the sound of each other's voices. We called out to each other regularly and sang to pass the time. For a time, Inamura was able to navigate by starlight, keeping us on the right track towards Okinawa. But then our luck turned. About 3 hours after the sun went down, the sky began to cloud over, and a wind from the north started pushing us south towards the island. We were so happy for the tailwind, it raised our spirits, until the stars were blotted out completely, and it started to rain. Adrift and blind, we were as good as dead. Inamura screamed. I could hear her slamming her fist against the water's surface. There was no way she could have planned for a rainstorm, and there was nothing either of us could do about it. We were cold, tired, hungry, and lost. When I heard her sobbing over the noise of rainwater hitting the ocean, I knew Inamura was ready to give up. But I was still frightened. Inamura had pushed me all this way, and if she gave up here in the middle of the ocean, I would die too. I thought, no, I genuinely believed that I wouldn't be able to reach the shore without Inamura. So I started calling out to her. "Don't stop! Come on, Inamura, we can do this!" "But we can't see," Inamura sobbed. "How are we supposed to find Okinawa now?" "We've got the wind, don't we?" I said. "The sun set on our right, and the wind is from behind. That means it's coming from the north. If we follow the wind, we can get to Okinawa." For a moment, all I could hear was the rain hitting the ocean. Then Inamura said, "You're sure we can make it? In the dark?" "Absolutely. I think we can trust the wind." Then Inamura laughed. "Damn, you must have the senses of a dragon. All right, Hime-sama, lead the way." I gasped so hard that I accidentally swallowed some water. You knew? How? How long?" In the pitch darkness, I heard Inamura starting to breaststroke again, moving along with the breeze. "Keep up, princess. Your secret's safe with me." Inamura and I started towards Okinawa again, this time with a little added energy. I frequently called and yelled at her, demanding to know how the hell she'd figured me out. Inamura refused to answer, only replying that she needed to let me know if she was straying off the path. "Come on, follow my voice," I called out every time I stuck my arm in the air to check the wind direction. "Stay with me, Inamura." Inamura always replied quickly. Sometimes she would be far away. Other times she would be so close that her voice made my ears throb. But no matter what, she was able to stay near me. The roles were reversed as the night went on. Now Inamura was the one who wanted to give up and stop swimming, and I was the one putting on the pressure to keep swimming forward, following the gentle but constant tailwind that I was sure was pushing us in the right direction. I didn't know if it was morning or midnight or whatever time in between. All I remember was that sometime before the skies turned pink, something hit my left foot, causing so much pain that I screamed out loud. A second later, I washed up on some sharp rocks, and I was resting on something solid for the first time in God knows how long. I rolled over on my back, listening to the surf smashing up against whatever the hell I'd landed on. "Inamura!" I shouted. I think I found land." No response. "Inamura!" I tried again. "There's rocks over here." Nothing came from the darkness, except for wind and rain. 3 more times I cried out for my companion, but I never heard her voice that night, or ever again, for that matter. June 3rd, 2012, Cape Hedo, Okinawa Island. I woke up with the sunrise and finally got to see where I was. I'd washed up at the bottom of a huge rocky cliff face, and the ocean was smashing up against the jagged shoreline with so much noise that I still don't know how I was able to sleep at all. To be honest, I wasn't sure where I was. I was starved, thirsty, and all of my limbs were unwilling to move. By the time I roused myself and got off that damn rock, it must have been mid-morning. The tide was lower than when I'd washed ashore, so I could climb and scramble along the rocky shoreline until I finally managed to grab hold of a tree branch and pull myself onto shore. There was a dirt path not too far from the beach. I followed it up a hill and walked almost halfway across a paved road before I realized what it was. Looking down at asphalt, I screamed and collapsed onto the roadway. I'd never been so happy to see something so mundane as a road. It meant I hadn't washed up on just any island. I'd gotten lucky to actually hit Okinawa itself. My joy was short-lived, though. I remembered that I hadn't seen Inamura since the middle of the night. I walked up and down the shoreline, calling out for her. She wasn't anywhere. I think my screams just became hopeless cries after a while. It wasn't fair. After everything Inamura did to help me get this far, it just wasn't right for her to go just like that. I begged every god I could think of to let Inamura come ashore alive. I didn't think I could live with myself if she died. And I remembered going into denial. I told myself, no, she's not dead. A current just caught her, and she landed somewhere else on the island. I started walking along the shore, and every step of the way, I expected to see Inamura jump out of some shrub and yell, "There you are!" If I followed the road, I probably would have been rescued more quickly, but I couldn't leave. I always thought Inamura was just around the next corner, that if I left without her, I'd be a terrible person. I wouldn't even accept any other possibilities. I don't remember how long I was wandering, but I know I didn't eat or sleep. I was in a kind of misery-induced depression. Or maybe it was the other way around, I don't know. What I do know is that I was somewhere near Kunigami village when I found a bunch of fallen trees blocking my path. I went to walk around them, and I heard the voice of a rifle safety switch being flipped. "Halt!" someone yelled in English. "Who goes there?" I was in so deep despair that I instantly thought the Soviets had caught me. And then it all came crashing down on me. I really thought I was about to be raped and murdered, so I just let my legs go out from under me, fell face down in the sand, and started crying. "Get it over with," I sobbed. "Please, just kill me." I could hear footsteps and voices, but everything that happened over the past 3 days was catching up to me. I was out of strength, starved, and finally ready to die. "Bloody hell," someone said. "Looks like someone dumped their prostitute in the middle of nowhere and let her walk home." "Sheila, that's no hooker," another voice said. "She's got her pants around her neck, and look at that symbol on her top. She's military. Navy, I think." Someone grabbed my shoulder and turned me over so I was face up. I closed my eyes, waiting for the end, waiting for someone to shoot me, and I just passed out. I'm sure my husband can take it from here. He knows what followed better than me.